Hello, today we're going to continue our discussion of religious and spiritual transformation by taking a look at the mechanisms of transformation. Revaluation, which as you know involves the conservation of means and transformation of ends of significance, and recreation, which involves the transformation of the means and ends of significance. As we learn about revaluation in our readings, Argument helps us to look at two different uh, types of revaluation. One is when we seek religious purpose, and the other rites of passage. And for this second type of revaluation, rites of passage, he focuses on religious death rituals. We will then take a look at recreation, which, as you know, involves the transformation of means and ends of significance, so as we said. And two kinds of recreation that we'll take a look at are religious conversion and also religious forgiveness. Have you ever asked yourself the question, what is God's purpose for me? I'd like for you to think about that for a moment and also reflect on where that process has taken you when you have, if you have, thought about that question. If you've gone down that road, that path, then you have a sense of what a revaluation in the form of seeking religious purpose is all about. Because we're looking for a new destination or end of significance in our life. Let's take the case of Kathy Hughes, which you'll find in your book on page 236. Kathy had everything going for herself. She was making plans for marriage. She was making progress in her studies to become a social worker. And then all of a sudden, she has a bad automobile accident that included some brain damage and other injuries, and everything changed for her. Her boyfriend broke up with her. She had to re-examine her career and educational goals and find a new purpose in living. It was a traumatic, really tumultuous change in her life. And when you read about her story, you come to appreciate that she did find a new purpose, and that was to reach out to and help other people who were going through similar kinds of difficulties that she was. Throughout life, we will find ourselves in situations where we may need to seek a new purpose, and oftentimes, especially if we have a religious orienting system to life, that new purpose will take on religious and spiritual dimensions for us. So Viktor Frankl, as you already know, is someone who had a lot to say about meaning in life, and meaning is one of the destinations of significance that we've already learned about. So he has some important things to say about religious purpose. And one of his comments about meaning that has really left an impression on me is his idea that meaning in life is something to be discovered rather than invented, and that meaning is out there waiting for us to discover it. It's up to us to make that discovery. He goes on to say that he believes the appropriate question we need to ask in life is not what does life owe us, but what do we owe life? His ideas are described in our book on page 237. I love this quote of his, of Frankel's. He says, someone looks down on us in difficult hours. Frankl told his fellow prisoners in a concentration camp, a friend, a wife, someone alive or dead, or a God, and he would not expect us to disappoint him. He would hope to find us suffering proudly, not miserably, knowing how to die. So for Frankl, meaning is something to be found rather than to be given, discovered rather than invented. Those are his words. The second kind of revaluation that we learn about is revaluation that occurs as we experience a rite of passage in life. Of course, a rite of passage is when a change takes place, where we go from one state to another state, or kind of a transformation, if you will. Here we're talking about the transformation of the ends of significance, which takes place in revaluation. So perhaps one of the most dramatic types of rites of passage that we can imagine is when we go from having someone we love in our lives to losing that person through death. If you've ever had that experience, and most of us have, you know exactly what I'm talking about, when someone close to you dies. So Pargament writes beautifully about this experience in his book. And he himself has had some personal experience with death, including the loss of a child at a young age. So in looking at religious death rituals as a kind of rite of passage, a word that we use to describe sort of the culturally prescribed kinds of religious death rituals that would be a part of a particular country, community, even faith community, would be mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G rituals, which are designed to help us keep ourselves and our lives intact while finding new sources of significance. When we look at how death is regarded in American culture, we might be disappointed in how, at least in some situations, it gets glossed over and sort of sealed off from American consciousness, as Pargament puts it. An example of this that comes to mind for me is drive-through funeral homes, sort of like McDonald's, where you drive through and you can pay your respects while sitting in your car. You can see the body, view the body from your car, looking inside a window in the funeral home where the body is displayed. One of the beauties of religious death rituals, of religious ceremonies, is that they do provide the living with the opportunity to go through a healing process in dealing with the loss of a loved one. And Pargament helps us to look at the different aspects of this process and how helpful it can be. So for Parliament, in his description of religious death rituals, he says that they help with, first of all, preparation and separation. They also help with transition, and they help with incorporation. So let's talk about each one of these. Preparation and separation. Religious death rituals help to separate the dead from the living. And they also help to separate the living from the dead, and they help the entire bereaved family in their separation from the community, and of course their eventual reintegration into the community. An example of how religious death rituals can help to separate the dead from the living can be found in an Anglican prayer used during the funeral services. Depart, O Christian soul, out of this world, in the name of God the Father Almighty, who created you, in the name of Jesus Christ, who redeemed you, and in the name of the Holy Ghost, who sanctifies you. May your rest be this day in peace, and your dwelling place in the paradise of God. This is from the Book of Common Prayer, and you'll find it in Parliament, page 242. There is also a kind of separation involving not only the dead from the living, but also the living from the dead. Can you think of ways in which funeral rituals, religious death rituals, help to separate the living from the dead? Well, one obvious way is the physical separation of the deceased body from the home and going to a location other than the home for the funeral service itself. Of course, in the past, bodies were often displayed in the home, but that practice is not carried out, at least in our country, like it once was. The family is also separated from the community in a sense. After someone dies, family members tend to gather together in their home where people come to visit them. They tend to wear black to signify that they are going through a process of mourning, that they are bereaved, and the community respects their situation, hopefully, and tries to provide support. So a second way in which religious death rituals can be helpful is in transition, where the funeral is serving the living as well as the dead. The funeral can help the family and the community to face the reality of the death. It can also help to protect the bereaved by providing them with additional support and time, um, and respecting their privacy during the time of their grieving, while hopefully continuing to be there for them and connected and supported in whatever ways are possible. And finally, the funeral itself can serve the living as well as the dead by protecting the community, because when someone dies, it doesn't affect just the family, but it affects the community of which they were part. I love this quote by Emil Durkheim, a famous sociologist. Emil Durkheim had this to say about how funerals can help to protect the community. Since they weep together, they hold to one another, and the group is not weakened in spite of the blow which has fallen upon it. The group feels its strength gradually returning. It begins to hope and to live again. In addition to religious death rituals helping with preparation and separation and transition, they also help with incorporation. They help with incorporating the deceased into the afterlife. They help with reintegrating the mourner into the group, and also with the integration of the living with the dead as well. I know there are many people who don't have a religious orienting system to life, and they may not have the same views of the afterlife that individuals with a religious orientation to life have. And those of us who have a Christian religious orientation to life, we believe in everlasting life. And for me, that's a great comfort. And this is one of the values that a religious death ritual provides. It helps us to incorporate the deceased into the afterlife. It permits the bereaved to imagine their loved ones secured and cared for. And there's a beautiful description of this in our book on page 244, where a father who lost his little girl talks about his image of where she is now. My picture of God is that F, first initial of her name, is up there running through a field, picking flowers and bringing them. And Jesus is sitting there on a rock. She is gathering flowers for him. I feel that she is right there in his lap. I feel that even though I still grieve and still have the pain and the tears, I have this picture of Jesus on a rock with a little girl in his lap and all these other little kids there and him telling them stories. And finally, religious death rituals provide the opportunity for the incorporating of the living with the dead. The incorporation of the living with the dead. And here, what Argument is talking about in large part is memories. How when someone dies, we carry their memories around inside us, and they are always a part of us. So we learn about the Reformed Jewish prayer that's recited at memorial services, and I wanted to share it with you. You'll find it on page 245 of your book. It's a beautiful prayer, and it emphasizes the importance of memories. In the rising of the sun and in its going down, we remember them. When we are lost and sick at heart, we remember them. When we have joys we yearn to share, we remember them. So long as they live, so long as we live, they too shall live, for they are now a part of us as we remember them. Of course, if some of our memories are unpleasant memories, this can make the grieving process harder for us. Some of those unpleasant memories might be the circumstances of a person's death, or some of those unpleasant memories might be bad things that happened between ourselves and the person who died in the past. Hopefully, we can heal with regard to those kinds of memories as well as a part of the grieving process. The second type of transformation that argument discusses in our readings is recreation, involving transformation of means and ends of significance. And here we learn about two kinds of transformation: religious conversion and religious forgiveness. A whole lot of interest has been expressed in religious conversion since the early days when William James and Starbuck both wrote books on religious conversion at the turn of the 20th century. And it's not surprising that it continues to be an area of great interest because of the sort of dramatic change that can result in a person's life when religious conversion occurs. Take the case of Brenda as an example, which you'll find in your book on page 246. Brenda had been in a succession of dysfunctional, abusive relationships. And at the time of this example, she had a violent episode where she was severely physically abused by her partner. She had this to say: "We got in the biggest fight we ever had, and I ended up in the hospital. I'm sitting there on the table, and they were taking pictures of all the marks and bruises, and I was waiting to hear whether or not my skull was fractured. They had just told me that my eardrum was broken. I was sitting there thinking it hurt a lot. I felt like I was going to faint, and I knew sitting there on that table that there had to be something different. There had to be a better way. There had to be more than this." So Brenda was at a crisis point, at a turning point in her life, and she was seeking radical change. Not just transformation of the means, but also the ends of significance and religious conversion, which often occurs in the midst of crisis in a person's life, provides such a radical change and opportunity for change for the better in changing both the means and ends of significance, recreation. As you're probably already aware from your readings, both in the book and some of the articles that I've shared with you, religious conversion can take different forms. It can be more gradual, or it can be rather sudden and dramatic. Probably the best example of that would be the religious conversion of Paul in the New Testament. But here's the way that Pargament defines conversion. You'll find it in your book on page 248. In an effort to recreate life, the individual experiences a dramatic change of the self, a change in which the self becomes identified with the sacred. Now, religious conversion can take various forms. It can involve life transformation. It can involve self-transformation. So let's talk about these different kinds of religious conversion. In the case of life transformation, what happens is that the person changes the way that they're living. Their existence has become the problem, and the objective of conversion is to create substantive change in both the destinations and pathways of living. In the case of self-transformation, change of self lies at the heart of the experience. And in order for self-transformation to be possible, the person needs to surrender. Self-transformation can only take place when there's an admission that the self is limited, and then there is incorporation, and incorporation of the self and the sacred. In other words, the sacred is incorporated into the self when self-transformation takes place. But this is only possible when the person is able to admit to limitations of the self. Often what occurs is that there are failures in coping prior to conversion that point to the limited power of the self and the inadequacy of what the person has been striving for. In AA, they have this wise saying where they define insanity as when you keep doing the same thing over and over again, but expect a different outcome. They also say your best efforts got you here. For those people who are just joining AA, who have a problem with addiction. So we are brought to our knees in a sense, maybe even literally, hopefully so. And we have to admit to ourselves and to God, can't do this. Can't do this by myself. This isn't working. I need your help. I need something greater than myself. Let's take the case of Asa Candler, who was the second son of the founder of the Coca-Cola Company. When he was brought to his knees and surrendered, you'll find his story beginning on page 251. He says, I was unusually troubled in my soul. Suddenly I heard a voice, just as clearly as I has ever heard anyone. The voice said to me, you must get rid of yourself. You must renounce yourself. You must reject yourself. These were surprising words. I should not have been surprised if the voice had commanded me to stop drinking. But this was not the message at all. It was myself that I was commanded to give up. Myself was the trouble. My love of myself, my fear of anything that might frustrate my wishes, my will had always been the central interest in my life. False pride had erected a barrier between my soul and God. So when you look at accounts of conversion, say those provided by Starbuck and also James, you'll see that surrender, the giving up of personal will, is an important element in religious conversion. It was in their day and it is now when religious conversion takes place. Starbuck describes this discovery made by one of the participants in his study, a 45-year-old man who said, all at once it occurred to me that I might be saved too if I would stop trying to do it all myself and follow Jesus. Another male, 15 years old, said, I finally ceased to resist and gave myself up, though it was a hard struggle. Gradually, the feeling came over me that I had done my part and God was willing to do this. You'll find these quotes on page 252. So, in religious conversion, the sacred may be incorporated into the self. The sacred is incorporated into the identity of the individual. And when this happens, as Parkman points out, the sense of self is not erased, it is expanded. And when this happens, the self is identified with one or more classes of sacred objects. A spiritual force, a religious group, or the whole of humanity. When religious conversion involves a spiritual conversion of a spiritual force integrated with the self, the individual experiences a feeling of connectedness with a supernatural power, one that goes beyond his or her own self-contained world. William James describes it in his book when he says about one of the participants he studied, the Holy Spirit descended upon me in a manner that seemed to go through me, body and soul. I could feel the impression, like a wave of electricity going through and through me. Indeed, it seemed to come in waves, waves of liquid love, for I could not express it in any other way. It seemed like the very breath of God. I can recollect distinctly that it seemed to fan me like immense wings. And as one of Starbuck's participants said, I determined to yield my heart and life to God's service. Religious conversion can also include a religious group conversion, where a religious group or leader represents the focal point of conversion. And it can also include a kind of universal conversion, where the person feels connected with all of humanity. When a person experiences a religious group conversion, you can sometimes see that in cults, but it also can occur where sacred power is attached to a local mainstream congregation and clergy, as well as to a non-traditional group. And in universal conversion, the person's conversion experience takes them beyond an identification with a spiritual presence or a religious group to a connectedness with the larger natural and social order, where the person just creates not only the self in the image of God, but in the larger social whole. So they feel connected with all of humanity in a sense, and strive to serve all of humanity in the way they live their life, where they view the world as containing a spark of the divine. Can you think of examples of people throughout history who may have demonstrated this kind of conversion? Of course, you can have more than one kind of conversion that you experience. But a couple of people who come to mind would be Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and Nelson Mandela. They may well have experienced and probably did other kinds of conversion as well, but we can see how they felt connected with all of humanity and were trying to make an impact on that level, where they very well could have viewed the world as containing a spark of the divine. And the second type of recreation that we learn about from a religious perspective is religious forgiveness. This is a fascinating topic to consider in the context of recreation from a religious perspective, because Argument makes the point that when we experience forgiveness, we end up transforming both the means and the ends of significance. And we all know how hard it can sometimes be to forgive. In the case of forgiveness, before forgiveness occurs, oftentimes something of significance has been taken away from us unfairly, when we have been treated badly by another person. And as a result of that, we may respond with anger, hurt, fear, resentment. And these emotions, as we know, emotions are a pathway of means of significance, represent not only feelings, but also coping devices, because they help us to distance ourselves from the person who's harmed us and to deal with it, for better or for worse. And typically they are only partially effective, because when we're in a state of unforgiveness, the pains of the past continue to intrude into the present. And this can exact a toll on us. if you have been in this situation before, as most of us have, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The painful memories, avoidance, possibly alienating other people, possibly having our health physically as well as psychologically affected. All of these can be possible consequences of living in a state of unforgiveness. So there is a heavy price that is to be paid when we are in that state of unforgiveness. Well, we're not suggesting it's easy to forgive by any means. But Pargament makes the point that forgiveness is designed to produce a radical change from a life centered around pain and injustice to one that at least provides the possibility of peace of mind and also the possibility of peace with others. So one of the things we learned about in our reading is that when we look at forgiveness from a religious perspective, there are certain ingredients that make up forgiveness. Pargament talks about 4 such ingredients: anger, tertiary appraisal, humanization of the offender, and action. So anger is almost always a part of the emotion that's experienced before forgiveness occurs. And we go through a tertiary appraisal process. If you recall, tertiary appraisal follows primary and secondary appraisal. And in tertiary appraisal, we find ourselves moving towards the most compelling option, where we try to maximize our gains and minimize our losses in how we cope with the situation. So we end up coming to the decision point: is it worth it for me to try to forgive this person? What are the gains? What are the costs for me to do so? The third ingredient is humanization of the offender. Argument makes the point that in order to forgive, it helps if we can view the person in human terms, not to excuse their behavior so much as to appreciate that the person is not perfect. We all sometimes do things that are regrettable, and in this situation we were on the receiving end of it. And to try to have some compassion, empathy for the person who is the offender. Again, not to say it's okay what you did, but to be able to have some compassion for them, to humanize them. And then forgiveness also involves some kind of action. It might be we decide to forgive, but without telling the person. It might be we tell the person that we forgive. Sometimes the person might not be alive anymore, but we still feel like we need to forgive them for our own sake. So forgiveness is a recreative form of coping, and it is a major radical change. So what makes forgiving religious? As Alexander Pope said, to err is human, to forgive divine. Well, you can forgive somebody without coming at it from a religious perspective, as we all know. But religious forgiveness offers the possibilities not only of peace with oneself and others, but also of peace with God. So in our reading, we learn about what makes forgiveness from a religious perspective spiritually significant. So if we are able to forgive from a religious perspective, it helps us to be able to seek our own forgiveness from God. Forgiveness provides us with the opportunity to live a religiously based life. It provides us with the potential to have greater intimacy with people and God. And forgiveness helps us to work towards creating a more peaceful and loving community. Another question we have the opportunity to consider is, how can religion help us to forgive? Religion can assist in the expression of anger and pain. It can assist in the decision to forgive. It can help to facilitate the humanization of the offender. And it can also help to promote acts of forgiving. Corrie ten Boom, who is discussed in different places in our book, comes up in this section on forgiveness. Hers is a rather remarkable story because she survived a concentration camp and went on to live a full life as a Christian person who transformed many lives. And she tells a story about when she was confronted with a situation where she was asked by the person for forgiveness. And she talks about how she could not do it by herself, that she needed God's help in order to be able to forgive. And this is a big way in which religion can promote acts of forgiveness and also help to facilitate the humanization of the offender, as well as help us in making the decision to forgive and dealing with our own anger and pain. So I'd like to share with you her story, which you'll find in our book on page 266. After she was freed from imprisonment in the concentration camp, Corrie ten Boom encountered one of her former SS guards at a church service. When he came up to shake her hand after the service, she felt frozen, unable to respond. Ten Boom then prayed to Jesus for the strength to forgive him. She described the following: "From my shoulder, along my arm, and through my hand, a current seemed to pass from me to him, while into my heart sprang a love for this stranger that almost overwhelmed me. The forgiveness she perceived was empowered by God. And so I discovered that it is not on our forgiveness any more than on our goodness that the world's healing hinges, but on His. When He tells us to love our enemies, He gives, along with the command, the love itself." Another hard question that's asked in our reading is, are there times when perhaps the it's better if we don't forgive? This is a very difficult question to ponder. And we do hear another compelling story in our chapter from about Simon Wiesenthal, also a survivor of a concentration camp, who was confronted with a similar situation to that of Corrie ten Boom, but he was not able to forgive this soldier. Wiesenthal had suffered greatly and had lost many loved ones in concentration camps. So one day when he was assigned to serve as a laborer in a hospital, he was asked to go to the bedside of an SS soldier who had been fatally wounded and wanted to speak to a Jew before he died. The soldier recounted the story of his life to Wiesenthal. He told of how, as a young boy, he was caught up in the excitement of the times. He joined the Hitler Youth Movement, later the SS, without serious thought or deliberation about those groups or the meaning of his own actions. Sparing none of the gruesome details, the Nazi soldier described his participation in atrocities committed against Jews in the war, including the firebombing of a house filled with over 150 Jewish men, women, and children. Throughout the telling of the story, the soldier expressed a great deal of remorse and contrition. In the final moments of his life, he was confessing his sins and looking to a Jewish concentration camp inmate for forgiveness, that being Simon Wiesenthal. And Wiesenthal asks, when he tells this story, when he told this story, he asks, what would you have done in response to the soldier's plea? Would you have forgiven the soldier? And then he goes on to say that he wasn't able to do it. He wasn't able to forgive the soldier. He walked away. Without a word of response, but that incident continued to gnaw at him over the years of his life. For me, arguments, discussion of forgiveness has given me a lot to think about over the years and has been very helpful. The account of the soldier you'll find on page 268, where I was quoting from Pargament, and Corrie ten Boom on 266, again quoting from Pargament, and some of Corrie ten Boom's own words as well. Well, thank you. I look forward to talking with you again soon.